In the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler believed he understood his enemies. He believed he knew where they would strike, how they would strike, and when. He believed that years of intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and the vast machinery of German military analysis had given him clarity. But beneath that confidence was a fatal illusion. What Hitler never fully grasped was that the greatest threat to his war effort was not an Allied army massing at the borders of Europe, but the enemy he could not see, an enemy that existed only in his own mind. This was Hitler's greatest blind spot, intelligence shaped not by reality, but by expectation. By 1944, Germany's military intelligence apparatus was enormous. The Abwehr, the Sicherheitsdienst, Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, naval intelligence, and countless field analysts fed reports up the chain. Maps were covered in colored pins. Charts tracked Allied divisions, airfields, supply depots, and shipping movements. On paper, it looked comprehensive, but in practice, it was deeply flawed, because Hitler trusted intelligence that confirmed his beliefs and dismissed anything that challenged them. Nowhere would this failure prove more devastating than in the months leading up to the Allied invasion of Western Europe. For years, Hitler had believed that the decisive Allied landing would come at the Pas de Calais. It was the shortest route from Britain to France. It had deep water ports. It aligned perfectly with German military logic. And because it made sense to Hitler, it became truth. Every report that supported this assumption was amplified. Every report that contradicted it was minimized or ignored. The Allies understood this better than Hitler ever did. After the defeat of France in 1940, Britain stood alone. But even as German bombs fell on London, British intelligence was quietly building something far more dangerous than an army. It was building a system of deception, one designed not just to mislead German intelligence, but to shape how Hitler himself thought. By 1943, the Allies knew that victory in Europe would require a massive amphibious invasion. They also knew that success depended on surprise. The Germans had fortified the Atlantic Wall with bunkers, artillery, mines, and obstacles. If Hitler concentrated his armored reserves at the correct landing site, the invasion could be crushed before it gained momentum. So the Allies made a radical decision. They would not merely hide the real invasion force, they would invent a fake one. This deception effort became known as Operation Bodyguard, the largest and most elaborate intelligence deception campaign in military history. Its goal was simple in concept but monumental in execution: convince Hitler that the real invasion would occur somewhere else. At the center of this plan was a fictional formation known as the First United States Army Group, FUSAG. On German intelligence maps, FUSAG was enormous. It appeared to consist of dozens of divisions. It was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, one of the most aggressive and feared Allied commanders. Its location was southeastern England, directly across from the Pas de Calais. But FUSAG did not exist. There were no real troops, no real tanks, no real artillery. What existed instead was an illusion, carefully constructed to feed German expectations. The Allies created fake radio traffic, mimicking the communications patterns of a massive army. Radio operators transmitted meaningless messages around the clock, following realistic schedules and command structures. German signals intelligence intercepted them and dutifully logged every transmission. They built inflatable tanks and trucks, wooden aircraft, and canvas landing craft. From the air, these decoys looked convincing enough to fool reconnaissance pilots. Even German aerial photographs seemed to confirm the buildup. Fake headquarters were established. Actors played officers, complete with insignia and routines. Vehicles were driven in visible patterns. Roads were deliberately congested. Camps were arranged with meticulous detail. But perhaps the most powerful element of the deception was not physical, it was human. The Allies had turned German intelligence itself into a weapon. Through captured and turned spies known as double agents, the British controlled nearly every German intelligence asset operating in the United Kingdom. These agents sent carefully crafted reports back to Germany, confirming what Hitler already believed, that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. One agent in particular, codenamed Garbo, sent hundreds of messages to German handlers. He invented sub-agents, reported on troop movements, and provided false timelines. His reports were so detailed and consistent that German intelligence awarded him medals, unaware that every word he wrote was approved by British handlers. This created a closed loop of confirmation. German analysts saw radio traffic, aerial photographs, and human intelligence all pointing to the same conclusion. The Pas de Calais was the target. Normandy was a diversion. Hitler accepted this narrative completely. By early 1944, the German High Command was obsessed with the threat at Calais. Defensive resources were allocated accordingly. Heavy artillery, elite divisions, and armored units were positioned to counter an invasion there. Normandy, while fortified, was not considered the main danger. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler was asleep. When he awoke, reports flooded in. Paratroopers, naval bombardments, amphibious landings. But Hitler did not believe this was the real invasion. He believed it was a feint. His blind spot had become absolute. Hours passed, then days. German commanders on the ground pleaded for permission to move armored divisions to counter the landings. Hitler refused. He was convinced that the real attack was still coming at Calais. If he moved his reserves too soon, the Allies would exploit the gap. Even as Allied troops fought desperately to secure the beaches, Hitler waited, and the Allies counted on him to do exactly that. Fake radio traffic from Fusag intensified after D-Day. Double agents reported that Patton's army was preparing to cross the Channel. Reconnaissance continued to confirm troop concentrations in southeastern England. Everything reinforced Hitler's belief. Weeks passed before Hitler finally accepted that Normandy was not a diversion. By then, it was too late. Allied forces had broken out of the beachhead. Ports were captured. Supply lines were established. The Western Front was reopened. The war in Europe had turned. This intelligence failure was not a single mistake. It was the result of years of systemic distortion. Hitler distrusted professional intelligence analysts and relied increasingly on his own intuition. He punished dissent and rewarded agreement. Officers who challenged his assumptions were sidelined or ignored. Over time, this created an environment where intelligence did not inform decisions. It justified them. The Abwehr itself was weakened by internal rivalries and political purges. Competent officers were removed. Reports were filtered to avoid angering the Führer. Reality became secondary to ideology. Meanwhile, the Allies built an intelligence culture rooted in skepticism and coordination. British intelligence agencies shared information, cross-checked sources, and constantly questioned their own assumptions. Deception was treated as a science. The contrast could not have been sharper. Hitler's blind spot extended beyond D-Day. Throughout the war, he repeatedly misjudged Allied intentions. He underestimated American industrial capacity. He believed Britain would sue for peace. He dismissed the possibility of sustained Soviet recovery after early victories. In each case, intelligence that contradicted his worldview was ignored. The Allies learned to exploit this rigidity. They understood that the most effective deception was not creating something entirely new, but reinforcing what the enemy already believed. Hitler wanted to believe in a decisive strike at Calais. He wanted to believe that Patton would lead it. He wanted to believe in his own strategic foresight. So the Allies gave him exactly that. The result was one of the greatest strategic victories of the war, achieved not through firepower, but through perception. By the time German forces attempted to recover, Allied momentum was unstoppable. Paris would be liberated. The Western Allies would push toward Germany. The collapse of the Third Reich was no longer a question of if, but when. After the war, German officers would reflect on their failures. Many acknowledged that intelligence had been compromised, but few fully grasped how deeply Hitler's own thinking had been manipulated. He was not simply deceived, he was guided. Hitler's greatest blind spot was believing that intelligence existed to serve his certainty rather than challenge it. In a war defined by technology, industry, and brute force, it was psychology that decided one of its most critical moments. The invasion of Normandy succeeded not only because of courage on the beaches, but because an entire enemy command structure was paralyzed by an illusion it could not let go of. In the end, Hitler didn't lose the war because he lacked information. He lost it because he believed the wrong information was the truth. And by the time he realized the difference, the war had already slipped beyond his control.